pull that stool closer, would you? The rain's lashing the windows tonight, and there's a chill creeping under the door that even this fire can't quite beat back. Here, let me fill your glass. This ale's been drawn from the cellar cask, and it'll warm you through better than any coal. You'll have passed through a few market towns on your travels, I expect. Seen the squares on a Saturday, full of farmers hawking sheep and drovers shifting cattle. The auctioneer's voice carrying over the bleating and the mud, calling out prices, knocking down sales with a slap of his hand. All very ordinary, all very English. But there was a time, not so very long ago, when the market saw a different kind of sale altogether. A sale that would make your blood run cold if you saw it today, but which, in its own time, made a certain brutal sense. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't about wickedness, though it looked wicked enough. It's about people trapped in a cage of their own making, with no key and no lawful way out. I'm talking about the sale of a wife. Picture it. A Tuesday morning, perhaps October, the market cross at Tunbridge, or Selby, or any one of 100 towns across England. The usual business underway, corn being weighed, pigs being prodded, bargains being struck. And then the crowd parts, because a man is walking through, and he's holding a rope. At the other end of that rope, tied round her waist or her neck, is a woman. She's wearing her Sunday clothes, perhaps. Her face is calm, or perhaps defiant, or perhaps carefully blank. The man climbs onto the cattle block, or an upturned barrel, and he starts to shout, "Who'll bid for this woman? Good worker, this one. Who'll start me at a shilling?" Now, you might think you're looking at slavery, at some medieval barbarism, a relic of a darker age. The Victorians certainly thought so. They called it a brutal exhibition of depravity, an abomination that proved the lower classes were little better than beasts. They tried to stamp it out, to bury it in the history books where decent people wouldn't have to think about it. But if you look past the halter and the auction block, if you step into the tap room where the real business was done, you'll find something stranger and sadder than simple cruelty. You'll find desperation, ingenuity, and a kind of rough justice that the law itself refused to provide. Because here's the thing they don't tell you in the history books. In England, right up until the middle of the last century, if you were poor and your marriage failed, there was no way out. None. The church said marriage was for life, and Parliament agreed. Divorce existed, oh yes, but only for dukes and earls. It required 3 separate court cases and a private Act of Parliament. The cost? Over £1,000. That's 20 years' wages for a working man. 30, perhaps, for a labourer. So if your wife took a lover, or if you both decided you couldn't stand the sight of each other anymore, or if she ran off and left you holding the debt she'd run up in your name, well, you were stuck, legally shackled until death. And here's where it gets truly vicious. Under the old law, a husband was liable for his wife's debts, always, even if she'd left him, even if she was living with another man across town. She could walk into every shop in the parish, order goods on credit, and when the bill came due, it was the husband they dragged to the debtor's prison. Not her, him. For the wife it was no better. She had no legal existence at all once she married, couldn't own property, couldn't sign a contract, couldn't even keep her own wages if she found work. She was a ghost in the eyes of the law, nothing but an extension of her husband's will. So what do you do when the law offers you no remedy? When you're trapped in a dead marriage that's slowly dragging you down to the workhouse or the jail, and the courts won't even let you through the door. You invent your own law. That's what the wife sale was. Not cruelty, though God knows it could be cruel. Not slavery, though it borrowed the language and the props of the livestock market. It was a divorce. A poor man's divorce, conducted in the only courthouse that mattered to people like them, the public square, with the community as witness and a pot of beer to seal the deal. The fire's crackling nicely now. Listen to that hiss and pop. That's green wood, that is. Burns slower, lasts longer. You'll want to remember that sound, because the story I'm about to tell you about Mary Skinner and her husband Charles and the silk handkerchief that bound them is a story about people who found themselves in an impossible position and did the only thing they could think of to get free. It happened right here in England. Not in the Middle Ages, but in living memory. 1828. The reign of George IV. Modern times, by any reckoning. And it all started, as so many things do, in a pub just like this one. The George and Dragon in Tunbridge was the sort of establishment you'd recognise. Timber beams blackened with age, flagstone floors worn smooth by generations of boots, and a tap room that smelled of spilled ale and wood smoke. The sort of place where a man could settle his tab with a handshake and his word was good enough for credit. On the 2nd of June, 1828, 3 people walked through its doors with a very particular problem to solve. Charles Skinner was a labourer from Speldhurst, a village just outside Tonbridge. He'd been married to Mary for 10 years, and for most of those years they'd managed well enough. But somewhere along the way, the marriage had curdled. Perhaps it was poverty that did it, grinding, relentless poverty that makes people sharp with each other. Perhaps it was something else. The records don't say, and it doesn't much matter now. What mattered was that Mary had fallen in love with another man. His name was John Savage, and he was a labourer like Charles. Not richer, not better born, just different. And Mary wanted to be with him instead. Now, in another class of society, there might have been a quiet arrangement. A separation by mutual consent, documented by solicitors, with Mary living apart and Charles paying her maintenance. But Charles and Mary didn't have solicitors. They had the parish overseers, and the parish overseers had rules. The 3 of them, Charles, Mary, and John Savage, had been living under the same roof. An arrangement born of necessity because neither man could afford separate lodgings, and Mary had nowhere else to go. The parish authorities were scandalised. They threatened eviction from the parish cottage, warned of consequences, made it clear that this irregular household could not continue. So the 3 of them hatched a plan. If the law wouldn't dissolve the marriage, they'd do it themselves. Publicly, properly, with witnesses and a ceremony that would make it real in the eyes of the community, even if Parliament refused to recognise it. They chose the George and Dragon because it was neutral ground, because the landlord knew them all and would let them use his tap room, and because in the culture of the public house, no bargain was truly binding until it had been sealed with a drink. The tap room would have been busy that evening. Men coming in from the fields, stopping for a pint before heading home. Drovers finishing their business at the market. The usual hum of conversation, the clink of tankards, the scrape of chairs on stone. And then Charles, Mary and John walked in, and something in their manner must have made the room take notice. Charles was carrying something, not a length of rough hemp, not a horse's halter like you'd use for cattle. He'd brought a silk handkerchief, expensive for a man of his station, soft and fine. He tied it carefully around Mary's waist, not her neck, a gentle tether, a symbol without the sting of humiliation. The room had gone quiet now, everyone watching, because they knew what was about to happen, even if they'd never seen it done before. The story had been told often enough, whispered in alehouses, passed down through the generations. The ritual everyone knew existed, but few had witnessed. Charles turned to John Savage. His voice was steady, formal, as if he were following a script written long ago in some other tap room by some other desperate man. "Will you buy my wife?" John didn't hesitate. "Yes. What will you have for her?" The price. This was the crucial moment. In some sales, the price was an insult, a few pennies, a single pint, a way of saying, "You're worth nothing to me." In others, it was substantial, pounds and guineas, a transfer of real value to compensate the husband for his loss. Charles named his figure. A shilling and a pot of beer. A shilling was a day's wages for a labourer. Not nothing, but not a fortune either. The beer, though, that was the real transaction, because in the world of the public house, the drink was what made it binding. The ale was the sacrament, the witness, the seal on the contract. John Savage paid the shilling. The landlord drew the beer, the foam settling in the tankard. And then the three of them, Charles, Mary, and John, drank together, passed the tankard round, shared the price of Mary's freedom. Charles held the end of the silk handkerchief in his hand. He looked at John, then at Mary. When he spoke, his voice carried across the silent tap room. "If you give me that handkerchief, I have nothing more to do with you." He handed it over. The transfer was complete. Mary laughed, not bitterly, not nervously, a genuine laugh, light with relief. Later, when they dragged her before the magistrate to answer for what they'd done, she told the truth plain and simple. "My husband did not wish to go along with my wishes, and that was the reason I wished to part." She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who'd found a way out of a marriage that had become a prison, using the only tool available to her. The halter around her waist wasn't a sign of her husband's dominance. It was the rope she'd asked him to tie, so he could hand her over to the man she wanted. The men in the tap room would have raised their glasses. Perhaps someone brought a round to celebrate. Perhaps there was backslapping, jokes about Savage getting a bargain. The usual banter that accompanies any transaction in a pub. But underneath it all, everyone present understood what they'd witnessed. A marriage dissolved, a new union sanctioned, the community's blessing given, even if the law would never recognize it. Of course, the law had other ideas. The parish authorities didn't accept the sale as a valid divorce. How could they? It had no legal standing whatsoever. So they did what authorities always do when the common people try to solve their own problems. They prosecuted. Charles, Mary, and John were all hauled before the magistrate, charged with conspiracy to defraud the poor rates, with attempting to create a false legal arrangement. The trial transcript survives. You can read it still, if you know where to look. The magistrate's questions dripping with contempt. The defendant's answers confused and hurt because they genuinely believed what they'd done was proper. Legal even. After all, everyone knew about wife selling. It was part of the fabric of life, like harvest festivals or hiring fairs. But the court didn't see it that way. The court saw 3 ignorant labourers trying to circumvent the sacred institution of marriage with a pint of beer and a piece of silk. They were convicted, fined most likely, though the records don't specify the punishment. The marriage, in the eyes of the law, remained intact. And yet, in the eyes of the community, in the tap room of the George and Dragon, in the lanes of Speldhurst, in the fields where they worked, Mary and John were married, and Charles was free. The law could say what it liked. The law didn't live in their world. The practice didn't end with Charles and Mary, of course. It couldn't, because the problem it solved remained. All across England, in market squares and inn yards, the ritual continued. Sometimes with kindness, like the silk handkerchief at Tunbridge. Sometimes with cruelty that makes you wince to read about it. In 1862, at Selby Market Cross, a farm servant named William Holmes led his wife to the auction block with a horse's halter round her neck. She'd left him years before to live with another man, but he was still legally liable for any debt she incurred, still shackled to a woman who wanted nothing to do with him. So he bought the halter, climbed the steps of the market cross, and sold her to her lover for a single pint of ale. 3.5 pence, that drink would have cost, the price of his freedom. The crowd found it amusing, a bit of theatre on market day, better than watching the pig auction. The police, though, they didn't share the humour. They arrested Holmes for causing a public disturbance. He managed to escape custody, melted back into the crowd, and the woman walked away with her lover, apparently not at all troubled by what had happened, because for her, as for Mary Skinner, the halter wasn't a mark of shame. It was the key that opened the lock. In Halifax, a blacksmith sold his wife for a shilling, then had second thoughts and bought her back, then sold her again to a different man for half a crown. The wife, when she discovered she'd been traded twice in one afternoon without her knowledge, gave her husband a thrashing in front of the entire market. The crowd cheered her on. Even in this strange custom, there were rules. There was fairness expected. A woman sold without her consent could fight back, and the community would support her. The prices tell their own stories. 50 guineas and a horse at Smithfield Market in 1815. A grand gesture, a public statement of value and finality. A Newfoundland dog and a pound at Carlisle. A quart of ale and 3 shillings at Manchester, where the wife rejected the first buyer and insisted on being put up for auction again until someone she approved of made an offer. But mostly, it was beer. Gallons of it, pints of it, bowls of punch and glasses of gin. Because the drink was never just the price. It was the ritual, the wetting of the bargain, the ancient custom that made any contract binding in the world of the working man. You couldn't seal a deal with a handshake alone. You had to drink on it. And so wives were sold for the price of the sacrament that would make the sale real. The law finally changed in 1857. The Matrimonial Causes Act transferred divorce from Parliament to a new civil court. For the first time, ordinary people could, in theory, divorce without needing an act of Parliament. But theory and practice are different countries. The cost was still £40 or £50, half a year's wages for a skilled craftsman, an impossible sum for a labourer. And the law was laced with inequality. A man could divorce his wife for simple adultery, but a woman had to prove adultery plus cruelty, or desertion, or something worse. The law had opened a door, but it had hung the door too high for most people to reach. So the sales continued. into the 1860s, the 1870s, the 1880s, growing rarer, growing more furtive, as the Victorian morality crusade gathered steam. The newspapers mocked them. The police arrested the participants. The respectable classes shook their heads and muttered about the depravity of the poor. But the poor kept doing it because they had no alternative. One of the last recorded cases was in Leeds in 1913. A woman claimed she'd been sold to a workmate for £1. By then, it was a ghost of the old custom, stripped of its community sanction, reduced to a sordid transaction in a back alley somewhere. The publican's ledger no longer recorded these bargains. The taproom no longer witnessed them. The custom died not because the law improved, but because shame killed it. The working class had been taught to see their own survival strategies as barbaric. The very people who'd invented this desperate, clever solution to an impossible problem had learned to despise themselves for it. But I'll tell you what I think. Sat here by the fire with a glass in hand and the rain beating at the windows, I think Charles Skinner and Mary and John Savage weren't savages. I think they were people trapped in a system that didn't care whether they lived or died, so long as they didn't cost the parish any money. I think the silk handkerchief was a kindness in its own way. I think the shilling and the pot of beer were a better solution than a lifetime of misery in a marriage that had died years before. The law said marriage was sacred and indissoluble. The law also said that divorce was only for people who could afford £1,000. The law, in other words, was written by people who would never have to choose between a halter and a lifetime in chains. So the people wrote their own law, in the market square, in the tap room, in the light of day with their neighbours as witnesses. Was it ugly? Sometimes. Was it cruel? It could be. But it was also honest and public, and it gave people agency in a world that had stripped them of everything else. The fire's burning low now. I should add another log, but I think we've reached the end of the story. The rain's eased off. You'll have a clear walk home, which is more than Charles and Mary had when they walked into the George and Dragon that June evening. Before you go, though, let me top up your glass one more time. Here's to the wives who sold themselves, and the husbands who let them go, and the lovers who bought their freedom with a shilling and a pot of beer. Here's to the poor who invented their own justice when the rich wouldn't share theirs. And here's to the George and Dragon, and every taproom like it, where the real business of England was conducted while Parliament slept. Now off with you, mind the puddles. And if you ever find yourself in an impossible situation, with the law on one side and your conscience on the other, remember this. Sometimes the answer isn't in the statute books. Sometimes it's in a handshake, a drink, and a community willing to look the other way. Some bargains, you see, are sealed with beer instead of ink, and they're no less binding for it. You've been listening to British Pub Law. Mind how you go.